Okay, welcome. And today we're going to be talking about user stories or growing an app one user story at a time. And just to let you know, I actually have a separate monitor where I can see people. So if you feel like being on video, it makes me happy to be able to see you. If you're eating really messy ribs or something like that, I completely understand. But if you're on video, I'm looking you eye to eye. Okay, so we're talking about growing apps one story at a time. And this kind of came out of when we were talking about user stories, people wanted more examples of it. So what I decided I'd do is I was working on a little app. I wanted to try to see what it would be like to do a rewrite of the invitation system that we use for the Agile Lunch and Learns. So I said, well, what if I go ahead and walk through this as if I'm doing it with a team? So that's what we're going to look at today. So here's an example. Here's our card workflow. We've got our things in requested, and we've got in progress, deploying, approved, and complete. And the way that we're kind of approaching this from a Kanban board is when it's in progress, it's being worked on. And once we get to the point where we say it is done being in progress, that's the point that we can pull it over to the next thing. So when we put something in approve, that means it's waiting for approval, and then it moves on to complete once it's been approved, which is where the user's signing off on it. So this is going to be a very lightweight system, just kind of give us a way to walk through what it would look like to develop things with user stories. Okay, so our first story here, so let's think about what this does. This is going to be a system where you can come in, you can subscribe to, just like all these invitations that you've gotten, you can subscribe to stuff, and it comes to you when we have an event, it comes to you on email. So the very first thing, and this actually is the story that I usually use with teams that are starting out with a new application, is let's get the application name figured out. So we're going to figure out what the application name is. And so in this case, we're working on the application name, and then we think we're done with it. So we move it over to deploy, and then we're going to get approval on it. So here's our first application name. And we put a nice little logo up there with it too. So we said it's called Calendar Email Server. So we take this and we show it to the users. And the user, or the customer's users, the people that have a say in how this is going to look. And they look at it and they say, okay, Calendar Email Server, or we're putting it there ready for them to approve, and then they ask the question, is that the right name? And this may sound silly, but on most of the teams I've worked with, when we start off with saying, let's just put the application name in it, this is the question that gets asked. We start on this application and then discover that we don't even know what the application is supposed to be called, which is fine because we're discovering early on. So if we get this story all the way through, we'll at least solve the issue of knowing what to call the application. But it also means we've solved the issue of being able to deploy this. And if you notice in this particular case, that's not just running on my local computer, that's running up on a server. So it's actually deployed where we were running it. Okay, so is that the right name? Well, we find out it's not, so we drag the story back over into in progress, and we do some more work, and we get it deployed, and then we deploy it again. It's event mailing list server, and this is what the customer wanted. So, okay, we now have that story. We can take it from approved, and we can move it to complete. Okay, so this is a very, very, very basic first story, but lots of stuff had to happen in here. So at this point, what does the application do for the user? So you should have Slido. You can go to Slido and that number over there if you want. It should pop up in the side channel for most people. If you're in some places that block that, if you just go to it on your phone, you can still participate. Okay, displays the title and the logo. Does it send email, allow users to create event, logs, output out? So what we've built so far, right? We know where we're headed, and all these things are things we may want to have at some point. But at this point, the only thing this application does is displays the title and the logo. Very, very, very simple. But in order to get to that point, I mean, we flew through it in about 15 seconds, but here's some of the things that had to happen to get to that point. We had to set up the developer's local environment. We had to create a small application. We had to set up version control. We had to set up a server. We had to deploy to the server. We had to agree on the application name. And there's probably about 50 other things that happened here that we don't even think of. So the screenshots I'm showing you are an actual application that I wrote walking through this process. And this particular first story, even though it was just I was using a programming language I haven't really done any web applications in before. It's using Racket. So it took a lot of setup just to get to the point that I could do this. And what I want to suggest to you here is you're probably, the Slido number, here, let me go back to this just so you see it. There it is. What I want to point out to you with this is the very first story you do on an application, you're probably going to, the natural thing to do is make it a whole lot bigger than it should be. Because you think, oh, well, that, just showing the application name. Now, how many of you, if you told the developers we want to just display the application name, would say that's too small. We want something bigger. That's what most people are probably going to say. But if it's too small and you finish it in 30 minutes, that's not a bad thing, right? But if you make it too big and it takes you 2 or 3 weeks, that actually is a bad thing. So the smaller you can get your first stories, it's much better to fail on the side of making them too small than it's going to be to fail on the side of making them too big. So lots of things had to happen in getting that first story there. Does everybody else have sound? Okay. It looks like the sound is working. We've had a couple people say they had, well, I guess if she can't hear me, that probably doesn't help her, does it? Let me just say. Okay. Okay, so next question for you. What is the next simplest thing we can do that the user or business can experience as progress? So there's not a right or wrong answer here, but just type something in. Like if you're thinking, what's the next very smallest, simplest thing we could do to add to this application, the next step? Is that poll working for everybody? There we go, okay. And like I said, there's no right or wrong answer here. Display the current date. That make a link to a calendar, display a login page. In a lot of cases, a login page would be the next logical step. Linking to a calendar, particularly if it's going somewhere else, just can we even add a link to this page? One of the interesting things about when I did this, I discovered that with my setup, displaying a static resource like an image wasn't something that came out of the box. I had to set, it just took a few lines of code, but it wasn't something I just had at my disposal. So I had to figure that out as well. Log in, link to a calendar. These are all good options. And there's, like I said, there's not a right option here. What we probably should do is sit down and talk to the developers and say, okay, the developers are going to know some things like technical things that need to happen. So some of these things that are listed here, like create a login, gathering credentials and stuff, they may say, hey, that's a pretty big thing. Is there something smaller we can do? And we'll be looking at kind of how that might progress. Okay, so in this particular case, we say the first thing we want to do is see if we can send a calendar invite. So as a user of an email and calendar application, so as a user of the system, I want the application to send me an invite so it will show up on my calendar. Now notice here, we've left out an awful lot of stuff. We haven't even had the idea of creating an event. So this was the next story that I did when I was programming this over the past few weeks. So if you notice what it does here is this page, I type in an email address, I type in a start time, end time, a title and description, and then you send it. And the next page it takes you to shows you this. Okay, we haven't even saved this in the database. All it does is send an email that's got a calendar invite in it, and then it will show up, like for example in Outlook, it will show up like this. So I can RSVP to it, which doesn't go anywhere, but it lets me add it to my calendar. So what I want you to notice here is look how much is left out of here, right? The initial thought is, oh, first I need to create events, and then I need to have people subscribe to the events, and all these things that we think we need to do first. But this is proving out some very important things, right? We're proving out, can I even, actually I've got a slide that explains that more in a minute, so let me jump to that. So very, very simple. It sends an event. It doesn't even keep it in memory. I just create an event and it emails it to me. I can prove that it's possible for me to send something on email and then it gets formatted correctly as a calendar. So what doesn't this story provide? Well, the event isn't stored in the system. I can't send it to multiple people. There's no way to record the response. There's no way to even tell that I sent this to somebody in the past, right? It's just a form. It sends an email. But what does this story provide? Well, it required me setting up an email account. I had, in this case, I'm sending it through AWS, but I had to get the credentials for that worked out, which sometimes can be as simple as this sounds if we just created a form. Sometimes just getting the credentials for that in some organizations might take a lot of work. It also proved that we know how to send email. That's not necessarily a given. Depending on your environment where your server is and stuff, that could be a very large task to get the ports open that you need and those types of things. It proved that we understand the time zones, right? When I sent this message the first time I sent this message to myself, it was like it was supposed to be at noon, but it was like at 6 a.m. in the morning or something like that because I hadn't gotten the time zones worked out correctly. It also proved we can send ICS files. We had to find a way to add the calendar files to the actual email that was going out, it's not a big thing, but it was something that took me a little while to figure out how to do that in this particular programming language. I gave the customer something to test on target systems. So, and this is the really big thing. So if we're providing this for a customer, like, well, for this case, I'm playing all roles. I sent this email to my Gmail and it worked. I sent it to Outlook and I discovered that there are some differences with Outlook. When you send a calendar invite to Outlook, there are, if the body of it is over a certain size, it won't register as a calendar event, but it works okay with Gmail. So what we've built gives us the ability to let the customers actually try to start doing this and seeing if it works, seeing how things work, trying on different systems. They can go out to the end users of the system and say, hey, just want to check, does this come through correctly to you? Maybe it gets blocked by spam filters. Maybe it, there's all these things that can go wrong. But we've moved a lot of that risk all the way to the very beginning because we've got this really, really simple form that lets us try it at the very beginning of the project. Okay, so what are some things that might have needed to be overcome? We kind of talked about those, but is there anything else you can think of in your environment? What do you see as being, in this very simple story, what are the things that could get in the way of being able to actually deliver this story? Is there anything that comes to mind that you've experienced that even in a simple story like this could likely become some type of impediment? Dependencies on other teams, right? That's a good point. If you need an email account and you have to get it from the email team and they've got a 6-month lead time, you may be stuck. Firewall updates, approval process, very good. So all of these things that we're mentioning here, we've got a very small, actually writing the code for that may have been 15 minutes worth of code. Now, finding the credentials and stuff like that may have taken as long as writing the code, or maybe it took 30 minutes, or maybe it took 2 hours or something like that. But it's really easy for us to start getting into the mindset of, oh no, that's too small. I'm not going to deal with something that's small. I need something bigger to make it worthwhile. But particularly for the early stories, there's all these things that can become barriers. And what we want to do is hit these barriers as soon as possible. Because if I grab something that's going to take me 2 weeks to develop, and I spend 2 weeks working on it, and then I start hitting these barriers, I'm going to be I want to bring those forward, right? I want to bring those so I know what these things are early on. And I may run into some of these things. I may start hitting those and decide we need to work on another story. We may get into this and decide that working on email first, that's going to take us 6 weeks to get that worked out. Let's put this back on the back burner because we can't deliver that. Get the process started and then go ahead and start working on something else. And it may sound insignificant, but teams I've seen that take this really, really so small it seems stupid approach are much more successful than the teams that try to get 2 weeks worth of work and then they get to the end and then discover that there's barriers. So the smaller you can make those early stories, the lower your risk is going to be because of all these types of things, right? There's all these things and every place is going to be different what those risks are. And chances are the risks that you guess about, there'll be even more that you haven't discovered. So trying to get it all the way deployed through is one of the best ways to lower that risk. A lot of back-end work, which is not included here. So in this particular story, I was actually doing the back-end work as well. Now, if you're in a place that has very complicated process for dealing with back-end work, there may be a lot more work in there, or you may have to get approvals, or maybe it's a different team that does it. Lots of things can become barriers. Okay, so we've added some more stories, right? So we've got, in our completed column, we've got the application name. It was very small, but we successfully delivered it. Then we've got email, a calendar invite. We've done that. We can now send emails, and it's got a calendar attached, and Gmail recognizes it, and Outlook recognizes it, and hopefully anything else we want to test recognizes it. So we've got some other requests here. List available events, require login for admin function, and allow people to subscribe. So we're going to look at this one, the list available events. So as someone who wants to attend an event, I want to see a list of available events so I can request an invite. So we code that up. So what's it now? This is very, very simple, but we've now done something. We've now had to do something in the database, right? We have a way to add events. So we reworked that form that just sent emails, and now it saves it in the database, and we can see them here. And if we click on it, it takes us to this, which looks very similar to what we saw before. We can type in an email address, and it will send it, and then it tells us email sent. Now, this wasn't a huge amount of code to change from what we had right here. Remember, before this was just a form, you filled stuff out. And then, so we've combined the form where it asks for the email with the page that the page that used to show us what people had put in the form. So we had most of this code here, and we were able to combine it in a way to make it work for our next step forward. Now, a lot of development teams will avoid doing stuff like this because they think, I know I'm going to have to do it. I know I'm going to have to do it this way, so I don't want to take that intermediate step. I don't want to make a form that I know I'm just going to have to come in and change later. So making this form to where it just sends me an email, I know I'm going to want that to write to a database, so there's no sense even doing it that way, the simple way first. That is usually a really big mistake, because what it does is it puts us in the mindset that our code is not something malleable. It makes us think that once we write code, we don't want to test it, we don't want to touch it again. When you have that approach to your code, what you're going to do, it will make your team, it creates a very different culture on the team. And what that culture does is it starts thinking in terms of, I've got this code working, I'm never going to test it again. There's not a reason to invest in tests around this because I know it works, and as long as I don't touch it, it will be okay. As opposed to the idea of, I'm going to actually write something here that's going to make this story pass, but then I'm going to come back and change it again a little bit later. If I'm expecting to go through and continue to evolve and grow the code, I'm going to be a lot more willing to invest in tests for that, because I'm going to want to be able to prove that everything works correctly. So this approach of taking things and just taking incremental steps, but always in a way that we can demonstrate it to the user, creates a culture around the way that your code works that's very, very healthy. And we can end up on a whole other talk on that. Okay, so we're over here. So I've got the list of available events. We've delivered that now. Okay, so question for you. These stories that we've looked at so far, how do these stories compare to what your team does? And just to give you an idea, the stuff we've got, by the time we get through with everything that we're going to do for today, it's about 500 lines of code. It's not a huge amount of code here. We're talking, a lot of these stories are changing maybe 20, 30 lines of code. Now, the language I'm working in is very succinct, so it's easy to do that, but it's still a very, very small amount each one. Okay, so 95% of us are saying these stories are smaller. 4% are saying these stories in this are actually bigger than what they're working with. So that sounds pretty cool. I'd like to hear about that. Or my question is just worded where it's hard to understand. But the small story size is really what's driving this forward. And these stories that you see, the other issue with the culture on it is the stories, by making the stories really, really small, I'm creating an environment where I have to continually talk to the user and the customer, right? I've got something, it may take me a few hours, I get it done, we show it to the customer, they say it's good, maybe give us feedback, we change it. If once it's ready to go, we move on to the next one. If I'm working in batches of things that are 2 weeks, I may try to be as a developer, I may try to be heads down for 2 weeks before I talk to the customer again, which isn't what we want. We want that really rapid feedback because that, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll show you in a second. Okay, next story, user authentication. Remember this one that we saw. As an admin user, I want to have an account on the system, so administrative functions require a login. Okay, so the developers look at this, and since they're communicating well with the customer, they say, this could be pretty substantial. Do we need to integrate with single sign-on? Do we need social login? What part of this is the most valuable? What part of this is the most valuable that the customer is needing today? Now, obviously, this sounds like something the customer is going to want, right? We know this is going to need to be part of the system. But what we're asking here is, what part do we need to take the next step that we can demonstrate value, even if it's not everything that's described here? And then we've got a bunch of questions. So then this is going to be the customer here. They're saying, we just don't want anyone creating stuff that isn't an administrator. Like I showed you, we were deploying this live. It was going out to a web server. And so what the customer is saying is, this is out here on the internet. We don't want people making creating some type of event that people can go to and then make fun of us because somebody put in a really stupid event out there or something that makes us look bad as a company. So we just want to make sure that people on the public internet can't create events for us here. So then the developer may say, what if we just put a password on the create page? Okay, now that's definitely not what we want in the end, right? We need to log in for this. But this may be a very good next step. And in this case, we can just do the simplest thing that requires a password for any admin functions, which right now is just creating an event. So we've only got a single page that needs to be behind authentication. So just putting a password on it may be a very simple way to do it. So the customer says, well, we still want more than just a password later, but if we can protect the create page, user authentication is less of a priority right now. Which means by breaking this out and saying we're just going to protect this, we're still going to have user authentication, but by just protecting this page, we can now prioritize other things higher than user authentication, where if we don't break it out, user authentication has to come next. So we've now created options for the customer that we did not have before. So we end up with a story like this. So as an admin user, I want the system to require a password for admin functions so only users can create events. So we end up with something like this. Oh, no, question for you. So this discussion that we just described between the customer and the developers, would your team feel comfortable simplifying the scope of a story within the sprint? Would it be yes, and they do it regularly, or yes, but it doesn't happen very often, or no, because they would feel like they weren't delivering what was needed, or no for some other reason? And my experience has been a lot of teams would feel very uncomfortable about trying to reduce the scope because they would feel like they're not delivering what they had committed to. And I would like to suggest that that is a recipe for scope continuing to grow. And when we go into working on stuff, we need to assume that it's not completely understood. And we need to assume that there are discussions we could have that would help us become more laser focused on exactly what meets the customer need and what could be either deferred to later or maybe left out entirely. Because as we go into working on stories, there are probably some parts of that story. In many cases, there are parts of the story that could be deferred until later, maybe even deferred till after you go live. And if we do that now, it becomes a barrier to going live. If we do it now, it pushes back the go live date. Now, maybe we do choose to go ahead and do it before we go live, but we want to make sure we're not doing something that, if we've got story or part of story A that we cannot go live without, and then we've got another part of story A that we don't really want to go live without, but we could if we had to, we better not do that second part before we do everything else that's required to go live. Because if something happens, people get sick, schedule slips, whatever it is, we want to make sure that option of going live without it is preserved. If we do the work ahead of time, we no longer have that option. We push the date out by bringing that into scope now. So these types of discussions are what give you the ability to push scope that's not absolutely required out till the very end, so you have the option of going live or waiting until it's done. Okay, so here's our board. Require login for admin functions. That's in the approval column, so we show it to the customer, and it's like this. Okay, we're trying to sign in. This is just basic auth. It just protects the page. Very, very simple. Simplest thing that we could possibly do to protect the page. So then we ask the user, does this meet the current need? And if so, should we continue with user authentication or move on to something else? So what the developer is doing is saying, we've still got this story for user authentication. We did the simplest thing we could to meet the first need, which is this is up on the internet. We want to make sure no one creates embarrassing calendar entries for us. What should we do next? Should we go on with the user authentication? And maybe we do. And for the developer, they might think in terms of, well, that's waste, right? We could have delivered this with the user authentication, and then we wouldn't have had to build this. But as a developer that just went through the process, I can tell you that the stuff I learned in doing this in a programming language I wasn't familiar with was absolutely necessary to do the next piece of it. As a matter of fact, when I did do the next piece later on, if I hadn't have done this first, it probably would have taken even longer than the combination of them. Okay, so we asked the customers if this is, what do we want to work on next? Customer says, this solves the immediate issue. We hope we can use single sign-on solution, but that still needs to be approved. So let's hold off on any authentication and focus on letting people subscribe. So they're actually saying the user authentication, we're hoping we can just use another system for that, but we're not sure. So let's go ahead and do something else right now, because we don't even know what we would want to build for user authentication. And they're identifying that letting people subscribe is the next thing that's most important for them to have to demonstrate. Okay, so sounds good. So let's look at the story. So compared with your team, this team seems to ask more questions per line of code written or ask fewer questions per line of code written. And up to this point, we probably have 150 lines of code, and that's about it, maybe 200. So there's lots more questions probably happening than what your team is used to asking. The thing that's enabling that, and that shouldn't be seen as a negative thing, the thing that's actually enabling that is the fact we're working on very small pieces and delivering those very small pieces all the way through. They can speak to the customer. Oh, is that a Aster? Are you saying that's a the fact they can even speak to the customer to begin with? Because for a lot of teams, that is a huge impediment, not being able to talk to the customer. We often create organizations in such a way that the customer or the user or whoever is getting value for it, or the person paying for the software, is not accessible to the developers, which is a mistake. Although it sounds like a few of you are saying that that your team actually asks more questions per line of code written. So that's interesting. It's not everybody in one category here. Okay, so remember, we're looking at the next story, allow people to subscribe. As a visitor to the page, I want to be able to subscribe by providing my email, so I will get invites for future events. Okay, so now the developer is asking a question. This story says they can subscribe, but it doesn't describe how the emails will be sent to them. Should we focus this on the sign-up process and a different story on the sending? So we have the conversation, and the customer says, I thought we could already send emails already. We already proved that part. The developer comes back and says, yes, but we can only send one at a time. We're going to need a bit different process for sending to a list of people, and we probably need to track who it was sent to, right? They say, oh, I see. Yes, let's focus this story on the sign up and create a new story for the sending process. So the developer says, okay, I created a story for sending the emails and for tracking the sent emails. We've got two separate stories for that we've created over here. What about unsubscribing? Should we create a story for that too? And the customer says, oh yes, that would probably be important. So notice we're capturing things as we think of them, even if we're not going to work on them until later. We're capturing them, and now we can prioritize them against everything else that's going to show up in the list. So the developer asks and says, do you want them to unsubscribe by clicking on a link or sending an unsubscribe email? Then the customer is saying, I'm not sure what's the difference. Now notice we're getting off in a little bit of a rabbit trail here. Developer says, well, if someone forwards their invite onto someone else and that other person clicks on the unsubscribe link, they could unsubscribe for the original subscriber. Customer says, we don't want that to happen, but we may be required for whatever reasons to have a link. So developer kind of reins it back in here. Notice we're coming back and say, well, we don't need to know that today. Let's just create a story and maybe note that as a concern. So notice we started to get off on a rabbit trail. We're like, these are some things we need to think about, but let's not hold up our ability to deliver things right now based on things that we don't know. So we create a story. The customer creates a story and says, as a subscriber, I want to be able to easily unsubscribe because I may no longer want to receive the invites. And then we added a few notes here about we're not sure what the mechanism is going to be, a link or an email. Here's our concern. We've got that. We don't have to think about it again until we start prioritizing that against everything else. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so a few hours later, the developers are talking. And, but first, we're going to take a rabbit trail here. I have another question for you. I want to get into the middle when I've got everybody's attention, hopefully. So what book would you be most interested in reading from Mark? These are two things that I've kind of have been working on for a while, and I'm going to get feedback about which I should finish first. One is Agile by Examples, so storage of agility. So we've got 12 chapters, 12 principles, and then lots of stories about how people followed those principles or how they went against the principles and what happened. Or an introduction to behavior-driven development for managers and other non-developers. So which of these would be most interesting to you to read? I'll leave it there for just a second. And while you're filling this out, I just want to remind you, I don't have next week's invite out yet. I will get that together. But don't forget, we've got Austin Chadwick coming up on I think it's the 19th of next month. And he's going to be talking about mob programming. I think it's going to be a very interesting view of how to approach that. And I also want to show you something I got in the mail just the other day. So after Ted talked to us last week, I now have my own Jitter Ted's TDD game. And I was explaining it to the kids, and I think we're going to try to play it here sometime soon. So anyway, this came, and I'm excited to see how that works. So if I'm ever working with your team and you're like, hey, we should play the TDD game, I have one now, so we can do that. Okay, so it looks like about 71 to 29. Okay, it looks like Agile by example is the one people are most interested in. So thank you for that feedback. Okay, so as we were saying, back to our regular scheduled programming. A few hours later, the developers are talking, and they have this conversation. So these are developers talking. So we've got the subscribe page. It says, this puts the email in the database, but how can we show the user that it works? So you click this, and it adds it to the database. So the other developer is saying, well, do we need a page that actually lists out the subscriber? First developer says, probably, and we can't really do tests without that. If we're doing tests through the UI, and we add a subscriber, we need some way to actually prove that this person is, shows up in the list. So, and if we're going to demonstrate this to someone, we need some way to do that unless we're just going to show them the database. So what they're bringing up here is within our story, there's some things that if we want to actually show people how it works, we may need to do a little bit more than we originally thought of. So they decide, okay, let's go ahead and create that page. 20 minutes later, they've got the page. Very, very simple. And it said there, it can evolve later if we need it to, but it lets us demo the software. Now, this is a very simple, it doesn't sort it, it doesn't filter, it's just here's a list of the names, or a list of the email addresses and their status. Very, very simple, very, very basic. Now, another question comes up. Does this need to be protected by a login before we can call this story done? Because we've now introduced something else that has information we may not want on the public internet. And so, yes, I'm pretty sure we can't show these on our public site we're using to demo it, just in case someone adds, I spelled that wrong, adds a real email address. Okay, so let's add a password requirement for this like we did with the create page. And say, uh-oh, we ran into a problem while trying to set up login on this page. It turns out there isn't a way to log out very easily with basic authentication. Question is, does that matter for this one? Well, it makes it very hard for the users to test it because we can't get them to log out. For some reason, we didn't notice this as much or it wasn't as big a deal when we were just doing the create page. So the question is, what's the next simplest thing we can do? And form-based authentication with cookies would probably solve the issue for this. So the question is, do we want to include authentication with this? So we've got user authentication, but see, it's at the bottom of our list of priorities because at the time it didn't seem very important. So we've only spent a few hours on this so far. So the question they're having is, should we split this off as something separate or should we make this part of this? Should we actually bring this story in because we really want to deliver these together to put authentication around this? They haven't spent very much time on this because it's very, very small. So they're going to go check with the customer. The customer says that the single sign-on doesn't look like it's going to happen. So we were deferring that user authentication based on the idea that we thought we were going to be able to use single sign-on. The customer is now saying, yeah, it doesn't look like that's going to happen or not in time for what we needed. So we're going to have to build something ourselves anyway. So they said, okay, I think we have a story for user authentication that's been deprioritized. We're going to bring that story forward since we now see we need it in order to make progress. So we updated the board. This story, they just pulled forward. So they're going to work both of these together because it's got all the information that they need in that particular story. So a few hours later, the developers are talking. And okay, we're done, right? It's simple, but we should be able to grow it to handle whatever else we need for the roles or logins. So we've got a simple page right here. You log in, and then it takes you to there's just an admin login. It takes you back. If you notice down at the bottom, there's a log out button, and it tells who you're logged in as. So that was a very simple step. They said, great, let's deploy it and get approval. They've deployed it. Can you update the board and see if the users can come take a look at it with us? So compared to we'll jump back to our story in a second, but compared with your team, this development team has shorter cycle time between each user's feedback point or longer cycle time between each user's feedback point. I think most of us are probably going to be in shorter cycle time, but the way we're doing this development work is explicitly designed to shorten that, to make that as short as possible, because there's a lot of value from that. Now, I've actually worked on teams for very large organizations where, because we intentionally did this, this is the type of feedback cycle we were getting. Matter of fact, some teams, the customers, the users are like, we want to be right here because you keep having questions for us. We're just going to work in your team room. We've got other stuff we need to do, but we're just going to be in your team room. If you ever need anything, just holler at us and we'll be right there, whether it's a virtual team room or in person. And that can work really, really, really well. Okay, why is the feedback cycle time less or more than your team? So this is just a free thing. So on your team, what is making it take longer, the cycle longer or shorter? Is it like, for example, is it because you don't have access to the customer? That true for a lot of people. Is it because you're working with bigger chunked stories? What are the things that might keep you from having fast feedback on your team or fast cycle talking to the users? Processes are entirely back end, so it's harder to get feedback. Okay, so and that's a good point. You're working on things that are harder to demonstrate to the customer. One thing, if you notice here, what we've tried to do is if there was something that was just back end, we actually changed the story in order to make sure we had something that we could show them. Bigger stories and time zones, okay? No direct access to the customer. There's no sense of urgency to deliver the most valuable feature or function. I think you've hit the nail on the head of that is a really, really big thing. If you don't have a sense of urgency, it's not going to feel like you want, there's nothing going to be driving this. Mostly speaking about future requirements, no direct access to a customer. Okay, and there's lots of reasons. I want to suggest, though, that you can probably make, if you can shorten that feedback cycle, you can probably make shortening that feedback cycle will require you to do a lot of things that will dramatically improve your development process and your efficiency. Okay, so we've deployed. Can you update the board to see if the customer can take a look at it with us? So we've updated the board. We've deployed, allow people to subscribe. We've now moved them over to approved. Users say it looks good. So they had the conversation I didn't have here, but the users say, that's great. We can log in. We can subscribe. Both of those stories look like they meet what we need. You can mark them as complete. So now we need a way to send an event to everyone who's subscribed. That's the next thing on the list, right? Send an event to the list of subscribers. So we pull that one into progress. And a few hours later, the developers are looking at this. They've got a list of events now, and it's got a send button next to each one of them. And when you click that send button, it sends it all out. Now, this is still very, very, very basic, very, very simple, but we're proving out what the application can do. One thing that it doesn't do is it still doesn't keep track of who it shows you who it's sent to, but that's not stored in the database. That could very well be the next step that we take moving forward. There's lots of things that we can do on top of this, but we can do it in the same very, very iterative, just taking a basic step, basic step, basic step. And if we do things in very small pieces, it lets us split things up in ways that will let us identify things that can be deferred until later. This particular thing, like the way that these emails are being sent, will probably work just fine for 10, 20, 30, 50 people. This particular code right here, though, I'm pretty sure if I put all 3,000 of you that get our invite right now, it might run into a problem with doing 3,000 of them. So I might need to do something different if I'm dealing with a really large list number. But this gives us what we need in order to get to the point that then we can start thinking about how big does this need to scale. Maybe this particular case, the list is only going to be 10, 20, 30 people, so it doesn't matter. Those are conversations we can have, and we can prioritize those things with the customer based on what they need. Okay, so that takes us through. I'm curious if anyone has, and that takes us through kind of the development stuff of what we got to. We got to the point where this is a very basic. This could be deployed. If there weren't as many of you on the mailing list, I could start using this today to start inviting you to the Agile Lunch and Learns. It's to the point that it would actually do that in about 500 lines of code, maybe a little bit more than that. But that's the process that I want to suggest can be a very efficient way of working. Now, there's lots of barriers to doing that, lots of organizational and cultural barriers, but we're able to be very, very efficient by doing something like this. So we're going to do a quiz and give away a book here in a second, but I'm just curious, does anyone have any comments on this? Thoughts on this process? How did it make you feel? Was it a good thing? Did it just seem like crazy stuff? You can type in the chat or just come off mute, and I'd love to hear what people have to say.
Yeah, Mark, I have a question. Like the tight relationship that you describe between customer and developer, like a lot of developers that I've talked to who have that kind of relationship, they talk about it like, the glory days. Life is no longer like this. So can you talk about like in a more typical scenario, where there isn't such a tight link or even direct line between the developer and the customer, like do you have do you have examples or experience with situations like that where things work relatively well, where the feedback is relatively quick? Like how does that go? Because I imagine like having layers of communication handoffs isn't
Well,
particularly effective.
so you're like how to get to the point that you have faster feedback?
Yeah, like say you don't say the developer just isn't going to be having a one-on-one conversation with an end user. Who is that developer talking to, um, and what facilitates that connection?
So an end user can mean different things here, right? In the like this application we're showing here, you've got end users that may be the people subscribing to it that you may not be able to talk to, right? They may just be people out different places. But you've got the people that are asking for it and the people that are paying for it. And those people are going to be, you want to make sure you're doing things that they see as being valuable and see as being progress. The the conversation I usually have, if you're not, well, first of all, Agile says you should be working together with those business people daily, right? So if you're not at least having a daily touch point, them being at the stand up or something like that, then you're actively avoiding following one of the Agile principles, which you can do, but you should expect that you're not going to have the same agility that you would have if you're working with them. But the question I usually like to ask is say, okay, is this software actually important? And if it is important and valuable, then we need somebody that thinks it's important and valuable to be involved in this. And sometimes the answer to that, when you start talking through it, is that the software is actually not valuable, and people don't want to come participate in it because no one thinks it's actually valuable. The other thing that happens is people see that it's going to be so off in the future before it does any good to them that they're not willing to show up because it's like, yeah, 5 years from now, maybe we'll be able to start using this. And oftentimes, if you start showing small progress and saying, is this what you want? And try to get to the point that you can use part of it right away, it's easier to get people excited and involved about it and get that sense of urgency when people are like, oh yes, we have something today and you're working on something that in a few weeks might make my life easier. I'm going to show up for your meetings because I would like my life to be easier. So that's those help. And there's lots of organizational barriers to this, so there's lots of different places, but having those conversations and trying to do anything that you can to get to the point that people see the software as being valuable, by giving them things on a regular basis and establishing that trust that we're not going to just disappear for 6 months and then come back with something and it's not what you asked for, it is one small way of helping with that. Doesn't solve everything, but sometimes that can help.
Yeah, thanks. I asked that for all the people who were probably wondering and not asking.
Very good question. And Eric says this is a really small application, so it might be easier to do. And this application is very small, but it could grow into something very, very large. And if you notice what we did is this application could grow to be salesforce.com. This is just the piece we started with. So it could become a very, very large application. But what we've done here is we've started with the smallest thing that we thought we could actually use. And yes, in your situation, you may not be able to get through it in 500 lines of code to have something that you're actually able to use. But there probably is some set that people could use today, even if it means you're hooking it up to other existing systems. There's some way to get people actually using it today that's smaller. There's a very high chance that whatever you're working on, there is a piece of it that could be delivered before all of it is delivered that people could start using and getting value from sooner rather than later. So you're definitely right, but I want to encourage you to think headed this direction, even if your situation is a little bit different. Okay, well, let's do our quiz. And we're giving away a copy of my book somewhere around here. This one, well, this was a proof copy, but Starting Agile, although you'll get the hardback version of it, whoever wins our contest here. So we're just going to ask some questions from what we looked at. Did somebody say something?
I would like to comment on, it's a really small application, so it might be easier to do. I'm working on a very complicated international multi-currency part in the finance billing part of an insurance company suite application. And if I had a customer to ask, do you really need this processing the extra fees or not, or can we just put them away into some account? I would have it much easier to sort the requirements of the stories and really be able to prioritize the things the customer really needs. And I can't do it because I don't have access to a customer. So the bigger and the more complicated an application becomes, I think the more valuable is a client, as a customer on site. So that's my take on that.
That's a very good point. And what I'm showing you here is, like, I've worked on projects that were originally quoted at 50 million. By doing this, we did it for 15 million for a big US government project. And it looked very similar to what I'm showing you here. Now, there were things that took, a week to do, but the early on stories that we were doing looked very, very similar to what I'm showing you here. So it's just don't let the example make you think that it's not possible to do small pieces of a larger system and just continue to grow it. How long did this particular thing take? I think I did this over the last 2 weeks, just a few hours at a time in the evening or something like that. It's not it wasn't a big thing. And it was using Racket, which is a language I haven't ever really done that's what I did that demo with my son with, but I haven't ever done any web development with it. So it's a language I don't even know. So I probably got maybe 10 hours in it, and probably half of that was just reading the documentation to figure out how the language works. So somewhere in that range. Okay, let's do the quiz. Okay, I see we've got 122 people, or more than 122 people in the room. We've only got 48 people joined. There's no downside of giving this a try. So does anyone else want to join here? Is it working for everybody? We'll make sure that. Is everybody able to get in? Okay, we've got 2 more people. And we will mail you a copy of the book to whoever happens to win. So I'm going to give it 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. And you can join late if you want. But okay, in this example, what did the first story do? Did it give the application a name and deploy it, create a calendar server, give people the ability to subscribe, or send emails? That should be send emails. What was the first story? The very first story we did. And yes, it gave the application a name and deployed it. Now, these were all things we needed to do. But the very first thing we did is just give it a name. And the reason I put this in here is I want us really to be thinking, what is the absolute stupid simple thing? So simple that we feel like it's stupid. If you start there, you will lower your risk much more than if you try to start with something bigger. And the application name is a great thing to start with. And a lot of places I've been, trying to get that application name through and deployed is a whole lot more effort. No matter how long I think it will take, it always takes longer because there's all these things that have to happen to get it deployed all the way through. Okay, next question. When the customer first asked for user authentication, what was their actual need? Was it to integrate 2-factor authentication, to block emails, to prevent the public from creating bogus events, or to create an Active Directory database? Customer is asking for user authentication, but when the developers talked to him, what did they decide was the real need at that point? And yes, it was to prevent the public from creating bogus events. So the user authentication would do that, but the conversation was able to slice it down to what was actually needed right then as the highest priority. Okay, leaderboard. We've got Chris followed by Eric, Anal, Astrid, and Bill. Next question. When the team created a list of subscribers, what drove that decision? Was it because there was a user story that asked for it? Was it written the acceptance criteria of the current story? Was the CEO really wanted it? Or was it necessary to demonstrate and test the current story? I see that, Michelle. I'm not sure why, but you're on your phone now, so I'm not sure. Sometimes some corporate installations of WebEx sometimes block the survey tools. Okay, so yes, it was necessary to demonstrate and test the current story. Remember, we got into it. We wanted to let people subscribe, and then when we thought, how are we going to show the users and the customers that this does what they actually asked for? They went ahead and built that list. Very, very simple list, very, very basic thing that they could do, but it was necessary to demonstrate it. And when somebody was saying that the back end work, sometimes there wasn't a way to demonstrate it. Notice that in this, we're actually driving what we do to some extent based on how do we show the user that we're making progress. Because if we don't have anything to show the user, or the customer, it's very hard to get feedback from the customer, and we end up with longer cycle times. Okay, we got Chris in the top spot, Anal, Eric, Jeff, and Astrid. Next question, which story was coded first? I thought we already asked this one. Maybe I asked it twice. Okay, the ability to send a calendar invite, the ability to create an event, the ability to subscribe to events, or the ability to password or protect a page. Oh, just of the ones listed, which one was coded first? Of these ones that were listed. Sorry, that threw me off for just a second. Oops, I went the wrong way. Okay, yes, the ability to send a calendar invite. It wasn't, remember we did the calendar invite even before we created an event because we wanted to prove out we could send the emails. We wanted to prove out that we knew how to handle ICS files. And there were lots of risks that we wanted to address in that. So we didn't even worry about creating an event first, and storing it other than just, can we have a form and it go out? Now that, I'm not saying you have to take that same approach in everything that you do, but it was a way for us. When I was coding this, I was like, I've never used this language before. It doesn't seem to have any way for me to create ICS files. Like there's no, I didn't see a library to do that. So I wanted to lower that risk by bringing that to the very front. Leaderboard, we got Chris, Jeff, Anal, Eric, and Natalia. I think I'm saying it right. Hopefully I got that right. What issue drove the change from basic authentication password to requiring form cookie-based authentication? Was it because the UI design was ugly? Was it hard to test and demonstrate with basic auth because users couldn't log out? Single sign-on wouldn't work with basic auth? Or one person on the team thought basic auth was a bad idea? Now, it's interesting how often this is the reason behind doing stuffing. It's not driven by anything except for there's just one person thought it was a bad idea. In this case, we said it was hard. There wasn't a way to log back out. And this was what I actually ran into. I thought there was a way to log out with basic auth when I did it, and I found some ways that I thought would work, but for some reason it worked fine with Safari, but not with Chrome. And Chrome was what I was using to test stuff on. So it's like, okay, well, that's not going to work for us. Okay, leaderboard, Chris, Eric, Anal, Jim, and Jeff O. If your team needs help with, okay, last question. If your team needs help with the development work, who should you call? Should you call Ghostbusters? Should you just despair and give up? Should you contact Mark? His company may be able to help you. Or should you call NASA? Now, these could all be legitimate, but only one of them is what I'm going to consider to be the right answer. And 6% of you say you're going to call Ghostbusters. 94 of you are saying I'll probably call Mark. But I just threw that in there. If you are needing help with development work, I mean, I'm great doing agile coaching and stuff, but we actually have some capacity coming up this year to partner with you and do development work. It works particularly well if you've got like a chunk of things that are really, really valuable, but your company never gets to, and you'd like to have some help moving those things forward. Let me know. I'd love to talk to you about how that looks. I've got a developer coming off one project that we're going to have some availability. So hit reply on something and let me know if that sounds interesting. I'd love to talk to you about it. And okay, and Chris took the top spot. Very good. Followed by Eric, Jim, Jeff, and Natalia. I think I'm saying that right. So Chris, if you do not have a copy of the book, you can take a screenshot or something, or I'll trust you. Send me an exterminator, I think is what you're thinking of, Astrid. So Chris, send me an email with your address and I will get a copy of this book in the mail to you, headed your way. Okay, well, that covers what we want to do today. Hey, no, it's on time. So I will stick around if anybody wants to talk about this a little bit more or has other things they want to discuss. But thank you so much for coming. I hope that was useful. And I'd love to, if you have questions or think of anything or want to give me feedback on anything, hit reply to something. I'd love to see those responses. But you all have a great day. It was good to see everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark.